David Hamilton, you are my 34th entry into my tennis journal, and it's probably been about since episode 4 that I've wanted to get you on. So we've been talking about it for probably what feels like a year and a half at least now.
At least, yeah, we've been talking about this. Is it a year and a half? Yeah, my goodness, at
Least.
least, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, at least, you've only put 30 more people in between, so I can live with that. I won't take that personally.
Yeah. And for the benefit of historical purposes, we are in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so how are you coping with all of that?
I have a book to write, and I have an exam. I'm doing a part-time university degree in mathematics and physics, so I have an exam in 7 weeks time. So I've just been so focused on those things, and then other stuff I do in social media, that I'm trying not to think too much about it, because I find myself so busy with those things, to be honest.
It's good. It's good that you've got those. I won't call them distractions, but I suppose from a mental point of view, it is a distraction. So
it really is a distraction for me. It's stuff that I have to do.
Yeah.
So I usually have a lot of traveling and speaking events, but I had actually planned this time to be mostly at home.
Oh wow!
So it's kind of odd that I am at home anyway. So it really has been a distraction for me. I've just been so really busy with it.
Yeah. So if I go back to when we first met, I think it's probably a couple of years ago now that we first met, just so the listener can understand where our paths have crossed. About 2 years ago on a level 3 course, tennis coaching course, I should say.
Yeah.
I was tutoring at Stirling University. We get, and I hate the expression, guinea pigs in for people to practice on. And David was one of those people, and perfectly lovely first meeting and exchange and so on. It was only at the end of that day that Sandy, that we both know from Dunblane Tennis Club, he'll love getting a shout out, Sandy Fleming, and he said, "Oh, do you know what David does?" And I said, "I have no idea, I've never met him before." And he told me that he was an author, written many books, and his latest one was on the side effects of kindness, which is a clever title in itself. Now, you've probably written a couple of books since then, is that right?
Just one since then. Yeah.
The
little book of kindness.
There we go.
Slacking, I really am.
So because the majority of my typical listeners will be connected or involved in the tennis world, it would be great for you to give a bit of an overview on the 5 side effects of kindness to see where we can overlap into the tennis world.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for that tennis guinea pigging that we did. That was immensely helpful for me because, as you know, I had only really taken up tennis about a year earlier. So that was immense help to me. Even though I was a guinea pig, it was immensely helpful to me. But the side effects, there's actually 5 side effects of kindness. And, first of all, I love calling them side effects because, I for the benefit of the listeners, I used to work as a scientist in one of the world's biggest pharmaceutical companies. I was building drugs for heart disease and cancer. And so whenever you talk about a side effect, it's always in the negative. But then a side effect is really just something that happens alongside the thing that you're trying to accomplish. So it turns out that when you be kind, there are 5 side effects, 5 things that happen, so much of which is inside your body. So the first side effect is that kindness makes you happier. And there's lots of studies that compare people who've been asked to go out and be kind on purpose, like to do a certain number of acts of kindness a week, and then they're followed over a period of time. They're compared, over a period of time with people who are not doing acts of kindness. And all of these studies show the same thing, that being kind produces a net gain in happiness. And some other studies suggest that there's actually real changes in brain chemistry as a consequence of that. And it really just comes down to how kindness makes you feel. So that's the first one. The second one is amazing. It's that kindness is good for the heart. And it works in a way that's very opposite of stress. So if you ask anyone what is the opposite of stress, almost anyone will say, well, it's peace or it's calm, it's tranquility. But in fact, they're not the opposite of stress. Those states are the absence of stress. Physiologically speaking, the opposite of stress is kindness, or it's the feelings induced by kindness, because stress itself is the feelings induced by stress. The feelings of stress are what produce stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol and what we know about the physical effects. But when you be kind, the feelings induced by kindness produce kindness hormones. I call them kindness hormones in my books. But I really just call them kindness hormones to make a distinction between kindness hormones and stress hormones, because these are the physical products of the feeling. So stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are the physical products of feeling stressed. So kindness hormones, oxytocin, for example, is one of them, are the physical products of how being kind makes you feel. But it turns out kindness hormones act directly on the arteries, and they release the tension in the walls of the arteries and produce a net reduction in blood pressure. So kindness hormones are actually called cardioprotective. And what that means is it protects your cardiovascular system. So
that's amazing. I think the thing that first appealed to me in the work that you do is that it's not, now you introduced me to this expression, I think, woo-woo.
Woo-woo.
A lot of people, when you mention this type of stuff, they think plainly almost like on a spiritual type level. Yeah. But everything you're talking about is on a scientific level. So
absolutely,
straight away, even with the happier and the cardiovascular impact, one of the things that we have in the coaching world is that it is quite a stressful job, and it's also quite a lonely job. And because of that, I think coaches instinctively become quite territorial about their area, and also the players that they coach, and there's not a lot of collaboration goes on between coaches. It's starting to change now, I think, in the last few years. So even the coaches that are listening, the benefits of being kind, not just in the feeling that you might get from actually the act of kindness, but there is actually a benefit for your heart.
Absolutely. In fact, even in the context of a tennis match, you know, when you feel stressed and you get tension in your shoulders, and then you start playing, you lose some of your form. I mean, you know, what if instead you think, God, I'm feeling really stressed here. What if I say or do something nice for my opponent? What if I compliment my opponent, or just do something, or even just in my mind, even feel gratitude or something nice about my opponent? Then what it actually does is it physiologically relieves some of the stress, because kindness is physiologically the exact opposite of stress. It's like a seesaw. As kindness goes up, stress comes down. Some studies have actually looked at that seesaw effect, and they find if you follow people over a period of time where you chart their levels of the stress score on a 0 to 10 scale, and then chart their acts of kindness score, meaning the number of times they've said or done something kind. And what you find in days when kindness score comes up, stress score comes down. And it really is like a seesaw effect. So even on the court, I mean, I've done this in life, you know, noticing that I'm feeling stressed and got out of it quickly by thinking or saying or doing something kind. And it has this almost instantaneous release of physical tension in the body.
I'm so glad you said that, because I have had many debates with parents in particular the last couple of years, and I've tried to introduce them to this concept, and there's been strong resistance because the nature of their relationship, obviously, to their child, and the competition element makes it so emotive. But one of the things that I've suggested, when, let's say, a parent says their child's opponent at the weekend was a cheat or cheated them out of the match, and I try and say, well, there's a benefit, or I'll play devil's advocate and say no child cheats, and they instantly go, like, they get so stressed out. And I'll say, look, if you believe that your child is being cheated, how does it make you feel? And they say, oh, it just makes my blood boil. And they're literally telling you almost what you're saying, is that they're releasing all this cortisol and adrenaline into their system. And I said, do you believe that your child will perform better believing that the opponent is a cheat? and they're like, "Ugh," then you can start to see the logic kicking in and so on. And one of the things that I suggest to them is that even if you turn it around and feel that the opponent is desperate, and that's what tends to happen. If somebody gives a bad call, it's that fine line between determination and desperation. Now, if I'm playing against you and you give me a bad call, I could opt for kind of response one, which is I call you something or I confront you on it, or option two, I actually feel a little bit of sympathy for you because you're in such a desperate state that you've resorted to doing this act.
That's
And
incredible.
yeah,
I love that reframe, because what that immediately does then is it changes how you feel, and therefore changes the tension in your body. So by being kind in that respect, by having that bit of sympathy, you will actually play better than had you got angry about the fact that they've cheated me.
And that's it. And that for me, 100% is it. And that's the kind of the lightning or the light bulb moment that I want the parents to have, is that I'm not suggesting that they have to believe that this other person is not cheating. The benefit is for their child to change the chemistry in their brain, to change the body language. And you know what it's like yourself. You've even gestured it a couple of times. The shoulders drop 5-6 inches. The body language relaxes a lot more. They're a bit more focused, a bit more, well, you tell me what's the result of cortisol reducing, and what's the counter? Is it adrenaline? No, testosterone going up.
Yeah, well, usually, there's a countering effect between stress hormones and kindness hormones, like that. As you increase kindness hormones, you have a net reduction in stress hormones, and many of the physical effects, even stress hormones cause a reduction in immune function a little bit. Then the kindness hormones actually elevate immune function a little bit. So. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, because I've often referred to cortisol as being like squid ink for the brain. It clouds your ability to see and think straight. And if you're thinking about a cerebral sport like tennis, where you have to move, think, and perform at the same time, you cannot afford to be high in cortisol, because you won't be able to see what's staring you right in the face. Even to the point where I've had young children who at the end of a match have come off, and I said, I thought you agreed that the guy's backhand was worse than the forehand. And they said, no, I targeted the backhand. And they've not realized the player was left-handed. They've not been able to see literally what was staring them in the face, and that the player held the racket in the other hand. So that for me is an indication that they were so stressed that they literally were not seeing what was staring them in the face.
I like that. I like that idea of squid ink, because in a sense, then kindness hormones are like something that neutralizes the color of squid ink and restores it back to clear again.
Yeah.
And I'm glad we're using these physical concepts, because oftentimes, like you said earlier, and I used the term woo-woo. Oftentimes when you're just talking about these feelings and stuff, people think it is all kind of woo-woo. But when you bring it down to the basics, it really does come down to, you have the feelings, but there's physical products of the feelings. You have the squid ink, you have the stress hormones, but you also have the clearing hormones, the kindness hormones, that are physical products of that reframe that you did in your mind. Like reframing, my opponent is desperate. I mean, that's an amazing reframe, because then you feel sympathy. And so you're introducing not just a feeling, you're introducing a physical product of feeling sympathy. Because there is that physical product of feeling sympathy is these clearing hormones, kindness hormones, but you could call them clearing hormones in sense of clearing the squid ink. And at the same time, there's a corresponding relaxation effect on the nervous system. Part of the autonomic nervous system is governed by your vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve is it controls to a large extent the reduction in heart rate when you breathe out. So if you were to take your pulse, when you breathe in, your heart rate increases. When you breathe out, your heart rate decreases. When you breathe in, it increases. When you breathe out, it decreases. If you take your pulse, you'll feel it speeding up and slowing down. And that decrease is produced by your vagus nerve. And what it does, it puts the body into the nervous system into a state of rest and relax. So you breathe in, you get into fight or flight, you're getting ready. And you breathe out, your body goes into rest and relax. You breathe in, you go into fight or flight. You breathe out, you rest and relax. So what you get is the sympathetic nervous system, breathing in, parasympathetic, breathe out, sympathetic, breathe in, parasympathetic, breathe out. So what pulls the breathing, the breathing out, what pulls the heart rate down is your vagus nerve. But the vagus nerve is also tied intricately into feelings of sympathy and compassion. And this is something that evolved over millions of years. Because humans, if you think about it, compared to other animal species, humans have larger heads when we're born. And what that means is human babies are born technically premature compared to other animals. You know, look at other animals will get up and walk around within a few days. Human babies need months and months of care. And it's because of the larger head. So human babies are born premature, so need much more care. So over millions of years of having to care for children, the human nervous system evolved so that the feeling and sympathy and compassion as parents care for their children evolved in concert with the vagus nerve, or with this caring. So it's actually often called the caretaking nerve. And it's so tied into your experience of sympathy and compassion. And as I say, evolved because of the larger head size, if you wanted to put some hard science on it. So what we have today is whenever you feel care and compassion, your nervous system immediately kicks into parasympathetic. Your whole nervous system goes into rest and relax. So over and above the clearing hormones for the squid ink, you know, the kindness hormones clearing the stress hormones, over and above that, you actually have fundamentally a relaxation state being induced in your body simply by you making that reframe to, I feel sympathy for my opponent who's so desperate to win this match, rather than how dare that person cheat me. The difference is phenomenal on the body.
It's just to not play devil's advocate, but just imagine someone hears this and confronts us in terms of, but how is it possible that you can detach that from being competitive? Is there any science behind that in terms?
Well, in actual fact, it's a reframe, isn't it? Because what you can say is, I can use this as a strategy. I can choose, if I really want to win, then I can recognize that I'm more likely to win if I experience sympathy. So then it becomes a strategy. So you're retaining your competitiveness, but you're just doing it a little bit more intelligently. You're understanding how the mind and the body work in harmony. And you're saying, now that I know that, and I'm so competitive, I know that if I, rather than get angry, I get sympathetic instead. And I reframe that so that I feel differently about what my opponent's just done. That is a strategy that works in concert with my real competitiveness to win. So I'm going to feel sympathy as a strategy to win.
I love that. But my response has been a little bit more almost overly logical, in that the competitiveness doesn't happen in between the points. You know, that I think there's this thing in tennis that people talk about the will to win. You know, I'm like, well, I kind of understand the drive and all this sort of stuff, but in the moment, it's the doing that leads to performance in versus win versus loss, for example. So if you take someone like an Andy, for example, who over the years has been criticized for some of his body language or gesturing in between points, but his ability to refocus and switch back on to actually perform is where the points are won and lost. And I know certain psychologists would say, of course, there's a kind of snowball effect. If you get your mind going too bad, it will roll over into the next point, which I agree with. But to know that there's an actual, or think of it as a strategy, is a much better way. I'll definitely be using that one instead of my overly logical one.
Absolutely, because so many, any psychologist working with a professional athlete, it will help them develop strategies for when this happens, when this such and such a thing happens, when this bugs me, here is what I do. Here is what I think. Here is what I will do with my mind. And so much of the strategies really are, here is what I'll do with my mind. Because oftentimes you've just got to find a way of getting your mind to look at situations, even when you're losing, you know, which is something I experience quite a lot. It is finding a way to, how do I deal with that and turn myself around.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to when I was about 20, 21 years old, maybe. And I used to practice a little bit with a guy called Tony Dawson from Aberdeen, who's people that are listening to this in the tennis world will probably remember him, but he was a very competitive, played for Scotland at tennis and badminton, one of these guys that was sickeningly good at everything. But he was a fantastic competitor. And I remember I used to struggle big time when I used to compete against people that there's no way of dressing this up, didn't like. I just had I was had a chip in my shoulder when I was younger. And he gave me this amazing tip. And he said, when you compete against these people, number one, smile at them. And number two, pretend that they're your friend. Like, be nice to them. And he says it'll make you feel a lot better and you'll perform a lot better. Now, here's me 27 years later. Actually, there was some science behind what he said.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because it's so much. I mean, so much of anything in life, even out with although we're talking tennis here, but in anything that you perform in life, anything that you do in life, so much of your effectiveness comes down to how you feel. Because how you feel will affect how you communicate. Even the things that you say, how you respond to any situation is modulated in large part by how you're feeling in that moment. And so we have to develop strategies for bringing a way of thinking to any situation, a strategy that can alter how we feel if the way we feel in the moment is having a detrimental effect on performance on the court or performance in any aspect of life. So one of the skills in life to apply to anything is what strategies can I bring to change how I feel so that I'm in a state that's much more productive.
Perfect. Now, going back to the 5 side effects, one of them is improving relationships. So what's the science behind that?
Yeah, well, first of all, think of it really logically. You tend to like people who are kind to you. And we tend not to like so much people who treat us unkindly. So it's really obvious in that kind of way. But scientists, I'll give you 2 studies on it, right, that explain the logic. Scientists surveyed over 10,000 people in 37 countries. Wow. 37 countries, over 6 continents. And they asked them, what was most important to you? What is most important to you in a partner, in a long-term relationship? And they had to really think about it. And you know what came out top in all 37 countries? More than financial security, more than a good sense of humor, more than good looks. Someone who's kind. Came out top over that 10,000 people survey. I've asked loads of people that, and they say that doesn't make sense. And the reason why it doesn't make sense is because we turn it around and we think, what would someone be looking for in me? And then we immediately think, well, that I better be funny and I better, have my hair all done and I better look good and I better smell nice and all that. But in actual fact, we've turned it around. But if you really think about it, and then someone asks you, what would you really like? And you have to really think about it. Then what really comes out of these statistics is someone is kind. So on the basis of that and other studies, scientists did several studies that are a bit like the Big Brother house. And what you do is you have a group of people interacting and you video them over a period of time. And scientists noticed, and it was a study of newlyweds, and they watched how they interact. And what you often see is someone making what they call a bid for connection. And that's what they call it. When you say, hey, come and check this out, you're looking out the window, for example, come and check this out. What it really is, in terms of human nature, it's a bid for connection. We're looking to connect with the person. So look out the window, whatever it is. So the partner will do one of 2 things. They will either turn towards, and what that means is they will engage with you in some way. So either they will come all the way to the window and look at it with you, or they will say, oh, that's interesting, well, and they'll at least show some positive engagement, or they will turn away. And turn away would mean it could go from the extreme of like, oh, that's a lot of rubbish, or it could be just kind of passive aggressive, oh, yeah, okay, and back to the phone or something. And what they found when they followed up, say 6 years later, what you find on average in these studies is those who turn towards most of the time, you usually find 6 years later, and these statistically, nearly 90% of the couples are still together. But in those who turn away most of the time. Only about 30 to 40% are still together 6 years later. And it turns out there's a ratio of about 5-1 that people who turn towards 5 times more than they turn away, that's a good predictor for the longevity of a relationship. But if it's less than the 5-1, then you start to get into that could go either way kind of, I mean, talking statistically. You know, but so that 5-1 ratio, and what it boils down, turning towards really is over and above love, it's a display of kindness. So what you find in all of these things is out with love itself, the glue, the underlying fabric that keeps relationships, not just romantically, but friendships and everything together, is kindness.
Yeah.
The willingness to be there for someone.
It's funny when I'm obviously, as you're speaking, I'm kind of thinking, right, wow, there's so many crossovers into tennis, but in a really basic one that we would use in doubles training, for example, and it's a tip that you would give to club players, to anyone that competes, you would say, in between every single point, you must always turn towards your partner.
Wow.
And it's and again, I've done it. Again, it's everything that I'm doing is more probably from a logical point of view, whereas you're actually putting hard science to it, which I love. But the whole thing, I remember very clearly playing doubles when I was maybe 14 or 15 with our club champion at Stonehaven Tennis Club, who, you know, was club champion for donkey's years in a row. And every time I missed a shot, he turned away from me. And even now, I can remember the frustration that it gave me, was that it was almost like he was abandoning ship. And I used to say that to doubles players all the time. Like whenever especially when your partner makes a mistake, turn towards them, walk towards them, so that they feel the togetherness, that when, you know, they're not to blame, it's a partnership, you win together, you lose together. So it's amazing the crossovers between.
Do you know, and absolutely never before have I made that connection to the tennis court. I've been talking about this type of study for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. I've been, you know, sharing this as an example with public audiences when I give talks. And never until now have I actually, I say all types of relationships, and I've never quite equated it to on the doubles court. Of course, absolutely, of course. Because otherwise you feel under pressure, and you feel, you know, if I feel my opponent, I've played a few times, and I feel my opponent doesn't like or doesn't think I'm good enough, for example, it puts me under stress, and I play worse. I play far better if I know my opponent doesn't care. They just want to enjoy the game, then I play my best tennis.
And it's to couple it with a sound, which is the most negative sound in the world, in my opinion. It's this. There's somebody tutting when you make a mistake. And this guy, I don't want to name the guy, but this guy was infamous for this. If, like, I would be serving and he'd be at the net, and I would serve the first serve into the net, and he'd go, tut when he'd serve it. And then I'd say I did a double fault, he'd go, just get it in, you know, shouting at me.
I know, but it's so true though. I think I said opponent there. I meant my partner, my doubles partner. I think I said my opponent, but I meant my doubles partner. But I certainly play better when I have a doubles partner who I feel comfortable around, and I know that they're okay with me hitting duff shots.
Yeah, you know, the bigger part of this improving relationships, in terms of, I touched on it already, is that coaching can be quite a lonely sport. So this is almost a message for the coaches, and I say this all the time when I work with coaches, is find a way of building relationships with other coaches and other clubs and other programs, and find ways to work together, not just because of the loneliness thing, but you will have a bigger impact if you work together as a team than if you are competing against each other. And if you, I use a silly analogy of Microsoft and Apple are stronger because of each other. You know, they push each other on. You know, if you think of all the big brands in the world, they normally have big competitors. You know, the Ford versus Volkswagen and so on. If there was no competition, you wouldn't be as strong. And if you want to use that, you know, it's topical at the moment, or at least timely at the moment. On Friday, what's this, Thursday? Tomorrow night, Andy Murray and Novak Djokovic are going to do an Instagram live, which will be amazing.
Yeah, great.
And they were asking for questions, and I was so desperate to ask this question, but they'll never read it out. But the whole thing of, would Andy be the player that he is or was when he was at his peak if Roger, Novak, and Rafa hadn't been around?
I know.
You know what I mean? It's a philosophical question.
I mean, I totally agree.
Yeah,
I totally agree. Andy became so much better a player because of the challenges of playing. You know, the best players, arguably that have ever, the best collection of players at the same time they've ever played in the sport, possibly.
Yeah. And if you think of that whole thing, to take it to the nth degree, is that off court, to be appreciative of your opponent and actually want, this is another thing that parents can't stand, is when I say that you should want the best for your opponent.
Yeah.
You know, they're like, because a lot of people, they want the hollow win, they'll take the cheap win if they can get it.
Yeah.
Where I say, no, you should want your opponent to be at their best, so that when you compete, if you win, you deserve the win 100%, and if you lose, you were tested to the best of your ability. I understand why they struggle with that, but that whole thing of wanting the best for your opponent is, in my opinion, another thing that is almost an act of kindness in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is. And again, it comes back to what we were saying earlier, that wanting to win puts you in a different state. Mm-hmm. And it does, and it really does bring out the best in you. And I can say that not just in the tennis court, but in my general life. When you want the best for people, you almost tend to rise up yourself. And it's what's that famous quote by Robert Ingersoll? We rise by lifting others.
Yeah, definitely.
You rise by lifting others, and on the tennis court, off the tennis court, we bring our best game when we want the best for someone else as well.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And to throw the comparison or the opposite in there, it used to wind me up when I used to take the Scottish kids to British nationals every year, and you would, let's say, quite often, to give a backstory behind this, British nationals used to be in pretty much the end of August every year, and the very best players in Britain have been touring the entire summer, quite often internationally as well. And it wasn't uncommon that the best seeds, or like the top seeds in the nationals, would lose first or second round because they were just absolutely gassed by the time it came to nationals. And you get all these kids running about the tournament, and it was like Chinese whispers, or like a wave of euphoria that, you know, have you seen the number one seeds like 4-1 down in the third, and they're almost happy that the top seed is going out. And I was like, what are you doing? What? I said, why are you happy about that? I said, have you ever beaten this kid? And they're like, oh no, he kicks my ass. I went, well, you've just lowered the bar because you are hoping that someone that beats you handedly is actually going to lose. Therefore, you've lowered the bar. You should want everyone to win or compete to their best. Therefore, we all collectively raise the bar together.
Absolutely.
It's tough for a kid to understand that, but as an adult, we can rationalize it a little bit better.
I know, but it's great that you're communicating that to kids, though, because the more times people hear these, sometimes you have to hear things several times before it kind of sinks in.
Yeah, definitely.
Once it sinks in, you take it on board, and then it really begins to work for you. I think when kids really get that, it can change everything really, really quick. I mean, literally, because it'll change how they feel.
Yeah.
In many, many situations.
Big time. So now let's get to other tangible things that you've used and I've stolen from you, which is, you mentioned to me about the process of mindful meditation to help you when you were competing in your in the club and so on. So could you give a bit of an overview on what's involved, or what it is and what's involved in it?
Yeah, so mindfulness meditation, I've personally found to be immensely helpful. I'll tell you how I used it, and I'll tell you a wee bit of the science of why it works. Is because I only took up tennis, as you know, about 3 years ago, and I've been on a steep learning curve. I found that no matter how much I was getting better, I would always get to this point. Let's say it was game point. People had never taken a game from before, and it's game point, and I'd see myself being 40 love up, and I'm serving, and I still lose the game. And I do that so many times. And what had happened is I'd suddenly, at that 40 love, noticed that I'm 40 love. I hadn't really thought about it until then. Now I'm thinking, I'm 40 love, and this guy's in the first division, and I'm at the time in the fourth division, so I shouldn't be here. And the moment all these thoughts go through my head, I double fault again, try to go down the line, go a bit too close to the line, the ball's out. Before I know it, it's juice, and then it's game over. Did it so many times. So I decided to do an intensified practice of mindfulness meditation. And it was through doing that for about just every single day or almost every day for a month, I found myself in a similar situation. And it was just, I was so much more clinical, win the game. And that situation didn't seem to occur as frequently for me. Now, the reason being is mindfulness meditation, for listeners who've never tried it, it's really just you become mindful of the fact that you're breathing. So if I was to do mindfulness right now, I would breathe, which I hope most of our listeners are doing right now. But so let's say I was to breathe, and then I was to notice that breathing is what I'm doing right now. So if I notice that I'm breathing, then I'm becoming mindful of the fact that I'm breathing. Now, the moment you become mindful of the fact that you're breathing, you give your attention to your breathing. If you were to take a scan of the brain, what you would see is the major activated region of the brain is a bit just above your eyes. So that your forehead just above the eyes is called the prefrontal cortex. And it really is the brain's CEO. It's the part of the brain that's most active when you're giving something your full attention. So for example, it's like if you lift a weight and let's say you go to the gym and you work out your thighs, for example, then you'll notice two things happening. The muscle will become firmer and it will become larger with practice. So you have exactly the same process in the brain. Obviously, neuroscientists don't call it muscle growth. They call it neuroplasticity, but it means exactly the same as muscle growth. So if I was to exercise or work out a region of the brain, so let's say my prefrontal cortex, then two things would happen. Just like muscle growth, it would become firmer and larger. And that's exactly what happens. You develop more connections. So it's like more muscle fibers and it becomes larger. So if you make a muscle stronger, then anything that you use that muscle for becomes easier. So if you make your prefrontal cortex stronger, then everything that requires a prefrontal cortex becomes easier. So therefore, concentration becomes easier because that's what the prefrontal cortex does. Another thing that becomes easier is ability to override feelings of stress in the moment and an ability to feel in control of yourself regardless of what's happening, an ability to stay present. So in a sense, when I intensified my mindfulness practice, what I was doing is I was taking that muscle to the gym, the bit above my eyes. So rather than working out my biceps or my quads or my hamstrings, I was working out my prefrontal cortex. And as a consequence, if I worked out my shoulders or my arms, I might have been able to hit the ball harder, but I worked out my prefrontal cortex, and that improved my ability to stay centered and focused. Even when that moment of stress, I could win a game here, kind of thing. So when you practice mindfulness, and it only takes 5 minutes a day of sitting quietly and giving your attention to the fact that you're breathing, just notice what breathing sounds like, notice what breathing feels like, and that you're now doing mindfulness meditation. And you really are taking your prefrontal cortex to the gym, just as if you were doing 20 reps on any particular muscle group.
That's amazing. The first time I really properly appreciated this is when I started to do yoga, because there's so much focus in breathing in yoga, and I found it was an amazing result for me in terms of holding positions for longer. And also that whole idea of attaching your breath to something. So for example, it would be like breathe into your leg, breathe into, and I was like, breathe into your leg, but then you do it and you can actually feel the stretch get longer. And that's something I historically I've not been the best sleeper in the world. It's been better in recent years, but if I do have a bad night's sleep, I actually have found peace by just lying on my back, putting my hands on my chest and being mindful of my breath. And before you know it, I'm off.
Absolutely. And because it also helps, as well as developing the prefrontal cortex, it also, remember earlier I was talking about as you breathe out, your heart rate slows down. By focusing on your breathing, what actually happens is breathing begins to elongate a little bit. So we intensify the length of time the rest and relax portion of the nervous system is kicking in. So when we give attention to a breathing naturally deepens on its own. So we increase more of the rest and relax portion. So that's one of the reasons why the body and the mind begin to relax when we breathe.
Yeah. It's such a big thing for tennis players. I think most coaches listening and most players, if they're listening to this, will at various points in their career been told the benefits of breathing. And in typical tennis world, it would normally be to reduce your heart rate, to be more calm and be more relaxed. But to hear all these other benefits in a very deep scientific ways, for me, it's more, I think knowledge is power personally. And I think if the more I would buy into this, if I knew the science behind it, versus most people, and well, I can definitely speak for myself. If you just tell me what to do without telling me the why of it, I don't buy into it nearly as much.
Yeah, I love the fact that meditation, mindfulness meditation research shows physical changes in the brain. It's not just about stuff that we've talked about in the past. Scientists, people have talked about when you meditate, it can reduce blood pressure, it can affect your breathing. It's only because in the last decade or so, MRI technology has advanced and other brain scanning techniques have advanced. Now you can look at density scans of the prefrontal cortex and see a physical change in the actual fibers. Just like having more muscle fibers, you have the same kind of, it's called neural connections, but muscle fibers in the muscles is the same as neural connections in the brain. And you can actually see an increase in the density of the neural connections in the brain from doing nothing other than spending 5 minutes a day noticing that you're breathing.
That's
and it's incredible.
We've all got 5 minutes a day, don't we?
Yeah. But great, because knowledge is, as you say, knowledge is power. Once you know that happens, you start to do the stuff, because it's no longer woo-woo. It's no longer something that someone's just saying, oh, you should try that. There's really strong scientific evidence. See when you said breathing into your leg, can I just share a bit of research on that? That really does affect your leg. Research at Harvard, led by a professor called Alvaro Pascal Leon. I'll drop the name there because he's a very famous neurologist. And he got a group of volunteers to play a sequence of 5 notes on a piano. So they basically went plunk, 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 up and down a scale with 5 fingers. They did that on and off for a 2-hour period. They had their brain scanned every day. The region of the brain connected to the finger muscles had undergone muscle growth. As I say, we call it neuroplasticity, and quite substantial neuroplasticity. You could physically see the difference in size of the region of the brain having done that 2 hours a day for 5 days. A separate group of people were asked to close their eyes, put their hand flat on the table, and imagine that they were going plunk, 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 plunk. It's called kinesthetic imagery. Just imagine how it would feel if you really were doing it. Like as if you were imagining doing a volley in tennis, you would imagine how that feels. So it's the same kind of thing. You're imagining how it feels to do that. They also did that, imagining how it feels for the 2 hours on 5 consecutive days, and had their brain scanned every day. Amazingly, when you put the brain scans side by side, you could not tell the difference between those who played the notes with their fingers, those who played the notes with their minds. They were exactly the same. In other words, the brain wasn't distinguishing between whether you were really moving or whether you were imagining that you were moving.
That's incredible. Now, is this what you did with the Andy Murray serve that I...
Yeah. So Chris, I did this wee scientific study after you gave me a video of Andy serving at the US Open.
No, it was just after he'd won the US Open, and we did a day at Craig Lockhart Tennis Centre. So I got the video just behind him. That's it.
Yeah, so you gave me that video, and Judy was there, and Andy was serving and knocking. There was water bottles, and he was targeting water, but amazingly serving and knocking the water bottles off with pinpoint accuracy. So I chopped a wee video. I cut it down to just the serve bit. It's about 4 or 5 seconds from the, and what happened is I decided I was fed up being technically probably the worst tennis player in Dunblane. I was bottom of 4th division, because everyone in Dunblane had been playing for years. And I thought, I'm going to science it up. So I'm going to visualize. But I found the visualization difficult because you need to have a mental representation. And what a mental representation is you need to know what you're visualizing. You need to know what it looks like. So I use this little tool called action observation. If you observe something being done correctly a vast amount of times, your brain processes it as if you're really doing it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So it massively speeds up learning. So I actually watched that video of Andy 3,000 times. And
Wow.
I say that with scientific accuracy because I made a wee table in Microsoft Word, and it was exactly 4 weeks to the start of the next league season. And I thought, right, my average losing margin in the league was 6-love, 6-1 on average. I mean, sometimes I'd score maybe 2-3 games, other times it's 6-love, 6-love. And I just, you know, it was just me. I was just learning. And so I decided 30 days, I'll visualize 10 serves into the juice court and 10 serves into the ad court. But it was so difficult because I didn't know what a serve really looked or felt like. So I watched Andy's video 100 times a day on loop for 30 days. So that's why I say 3,000 times. See, after about 3 days of doing that, I had an ingrained picture in my mind of what a really good serve looked like. So after about 3 days, now I could visualize. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I did it for 30 days and I went down to the court and hit about 100 balls once a week. To cut a long story short, I won the league. I won the fourth, and then I won the third without dropping a set. Now, I'm not a great tennis player by any manner of means, and I'm not trying to impress anyone, but I'm trying to impress upon you how fast my game changed. Really just by using visualization. And it's what you said, knowledge is power. I knew that as I was doing that, I was causing massive, substantial changes to the circuitry of my brain, and there would have to be a physical benefit of that. It would have to be. And for me, it translated, my serve improvement gave me much more confidence in the court. So I was no longer always, usually within 10 minutes, I was 4-love down on average. And all of a sudden I wasn't 4-love down, it was 2-all. And that changed the whole dynamic for me. No. And so I just stuttered through.
Yeah, this is like music to my ears here, because I was just speaking to a coach this morning actually about how, and I know there's a touch of romanticism going on here, but I was speaking about this idea that in the 80s, when I first started playing tennis, there wasn't that much tennis on TV, but what it was on, I would record as much as I could. And I recalled, remember when VHS tapes, and you could buy 3-hour tapes or 5-hour, you know, that stuff. I saved up my pocket money and bought this 5-hour tape to record the end of season. It was called the Nabisco Masters. It's the World Tour Finals as we know it, and it was Lendl versus Becker in 1988. It turned into be this classic match. I honestly burnt that tape out. Like I would watch it, rewind it, watch it, rewind it. Just any spare time I was watching it. And the point I was making to this coach this morning is, and it could be overly nostalgic, but I don't believe that the children nowadays love the game the way that we did. Now, there could be a few people out there arguing that, and that's fine, but they don't study the game. And I tell them the benefits of watching, imagining them being that player. And back to stuff we probably did as kids naturally. It was like, maybe it was football for you or whatever, but tennis for me, it would be, I'll be Becker, you be McEnroe, I'll be Becker, you be Lendl, I'll be, you know, and then you would practice things that they would do because you were role playing the fact that they were like a serve volley, and I never serve volleyed, but when I was Boris Becker, I serve volleyed. So I used to, and kids, you see them, the ones that do watch tennis, they copy the mannerisms, they shadow stroke exactly how the players play.
And that's how it works. It's accelerated learning. There's actually serious scientific research going into what you've done as a teenager, Chris. Serious research. It's called action observation. And research now finds you can rapidly increase the rate of learning if you use action observation. So in other words, you have to watch, and the key is you've got to watch it being done properly. If you watch it being incorrectly, then all you wire into the brain is how to do it wrong. Yeah. But if you watch it on repetitive, and I'm talking dozens and dozens, I did it obviously 3,000 times. It doesn't have to be quite as extreme as that. But most studies have people doing, like, they maybe watch something 20 times, and then they watch it another 20 times, then another 20 times, and then they visualize. So it's like maybe 60 times you'll watch something per session. And then almost all the action observation studies for tennis, golf, basketball, you name it, whatever the person, whatever, anything that involves a mechanical movement, whatever that mechanical movement is, almost all of the studies show that action observation rapidly and vastly increases speed of learning of a physical coordinated movement. And that, I knew that. That's why I did it with Andy's thing, because I knew that the research on that.
It's a great point for coaches, because I think a lot of tennis players instinctively hook on what they don't do so well.
Yeah.
So if you, let's say you have a little habit that you don't follow through on your forehand and it crosses your body, and and the amount of kids that make that mistake when they get tight, and then what they'll do is they'll be walking back to the baseline and they'll be replaying the bad shot in their mind, like literally gesturing it,
visualizing
it. And I'm like, well, you've actually not just played that shot once with a ball, you've just played it another 3 times before you got back to the baseline. So they're reinforcing the wrong image, which
absolutely
I would guess has the same effect, but in the opposite direction.
It has the same effect, really what we should be finding is, like we talked about earlier, finding a way to change how you feel about it. And if you're going to visualize anything, just quickly imagine what you would have done a couple of times. But do it from a relaxed space, because what you've done, you've changed, you've reframed it in your mind so that you're not feeling angry, you're not feeling hurt or stressed about it. And now you're using this as a strategy. Now what I'll do is I'll imagine myself in a relaxed state now, playing that shot absolutely wonderful, exactly how I wanted. And I'll do it 2 or 3 times in my head before I now take my next shot.
Yeah. And I always remember the Williams sisters were amazing for that when they were earlier in their career. The amount of times they'd make a mistake and they'd instantly gesture what they should have done or could have done in terms of cleaning out the stroke. And it always struck me that, when they would make a mistake, they'd just shadow the correct version before they'd start the next point. And they obviously had tapped into this at some point in their career. So
absolutely.
Perfect. Now, this was a question I was going to throw at you, because you mentioned the prefrontal cortex. So this is something that I've heard on several podcasts in the last year or so. And it would be, I'm pretty sure you'll know what it is, but I would like someone to explain it in layman's terms to me. And it related to this quote, and it was I can't remember his name now, but he is a very famous brain doctor, for lack of a better expression. And he was one of the ones that pioneered doing brain scans to check all these different things that you've talked about. And he said, woe betide anyone experiences uber fame before their frontal lobes are fully developed.
Yeah.
What are your frontal lobes for?
Well, frontal lobes are part of the prefrontal cortex. They give you that ability to be able to be in the moment, to have presence. So when stressful situations are happening, you can overrule the stress, you can overrule the environment and the context and stay centered and balanced. And so what that, in one respect, refers to is, if you get famous before you can handle it, before you can be present enough to be yourself, then that's why you woe betide, because the frontal lobes play such a big role in being able to control yourself, being able to stay centered and focused regardless of the situation, the environment.
Perfect. I've said it to so many people, but it irked me slightly that I kind of knew the gist of it, but I didn't know the exact science behind it. But it happens as a big one for tennis. And again, any tennis players listening or coaches listening now, players that think they are Jack the Lad or have achieved something before they've actually done anything, or they could be like 15 years old and win a big tournament and they think they've arrived. So it's trying to keep present, keep their feet on the ground, and so on.
Yeah, the frontal lobes, they're just a part of the prefrontal cortex. They just help you to maintain calm and presence. I mean, look at Federer, for example. Over the years, how many, and Nadal and Andy as well, and Novak, and how many times over the years have they been able to maintain a state of presence and calm, regardless of the moment that's facing them or the context, or even when they're losing? And that, you need a well-developed set of frontal lobes, of prefrontal cortex, to be able to do that. Without a well-developed prefrontal cortex, frontal lobes, you just couldn't do that. I mean, so I would say to anyone who wants to get to the top in anything, you've got to work on your frontal lobes, your prefrontal cortex. And one of the best ways to do it is as well as paying attention to everything you do, pay attention to all the strokes you're doing, really give everything your maximum focus, but also practice meditation, practice mindfulness as an extra backup, because you're always then working on it. So building the strength from the bottom up, if you like.
Is there a logic in that someone who has a healthy perspective or self-worth, for example, they attach their self-worth to something like being kind to others, is there logic in that also helping develop the frontal lobes?
Well, in a sense, if you have a healthy sense of self-worth, then it's easier to bring your attention to any situation, because your mind is less distracted on needing people to like you or approve of you or to get justification or stuff. You generally find that if you've got a better sense of self-worth, self-value, then it's easier to be present in any situation. It's just less of an internal distraction. As the mind wanders all the time, it's easier to be present and focused when you have a better sense of self-worth.
It strikes me that I'd love to have had Rafa Nadal's brain scanned when he was maybe 22, 23, because, if I'm led to believe correctly, these frontal lobes in males normally fully develop about 26, 27 years old. And I think females maybe a little bit earlier. And this was the context that I was kind of thinking of it in tennis, is that there's a big shift, I believe, in tennis players when they get to about that age, where they all of a sudden, you hear them getting interviewed and they have a better sense of perspective. Quite often it can correlate with either being married or having children. Yeah. So if you look at tennis players like Roger, Andy, Novak, all of them had great periods of play after they had children, because their whole values will be realigned, and they'll have that whole sense of perspective, tennis not being the be all and end all. Yeah. So but as Rafa has always seemed to have had it from a very young age, because it seemed to have been drummed into him that you have to be humble, you have to show respect and show humility and so on. So I'd love to have had his brain scan.
I know, because by learning that humility and respect and all, what that does, it helps you to remain centered and focused and balanced, and that will correlate with increased functioning of the frontal lobes of the prefrontal cortex if you get that drilled into you.
Yeah, and there's no player, I don't think, in history that's played or competed in every point as relentlessly as Rafa has, in terms of being able to just reset and go again. He's the kind of player, I heard it recently, somebody say, if you had one player to play for your life, it would be you choose Rafa, because he gives 100% at every single point.
Point. And that also correlates with the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes, is that ability to concentrate fully. I mean, literally, it's like a muscle. The stronger a muscle is, the more weight you can lift. So the stronger the prefrontal cortex is, the more you can focus, and the better your focus, regardless of what the situation is. So Rafa probably, if you scanned his brain, would probably have a super powerful prefrontal cortex stroke frontal lobes, and that comes out of practice of things like breathing and bringing your attention, but also practice at paying attention to whatever you're doing, because you don't necessarily just have to do mindfulness, because obviously I don't know what all the pros do, but practice at paying attention, practice at giving your attention to whatever you're doing in the moment. I mean, I could practice mindfulness right now by reaching for my bottle of water and just giving that full sensory experience my attention. So rather than me bringing my bottle of water and at the same time I'm thinking what I'm going to do next, and I'm thinking, I need to send that email, instead I just bring my full focus to the fact, here's my water bottle, and I'm just paying attention to it. Anything like that develops the prefrontal cortex, which means you can build that muscle all throughout the day by just giving whatever you're doing your full attention, and that reduces how much mind wandering goes on, because as the mind wanders, you start activating other parts of the brain. If you want to build this part, you give whatever you're doing your maximal attention in the moment.
This is brilliant because one of the things that I am keen to, let's say, bring to the performance tennis world, for I don't like the expression, but it's just what it's called, is a sense of play. So I do believe that we treat people with better or more ability with more seriousness. So, but we're all human, and the best players
Yeah,
still want to have fun and play. But if you, they can, let's say the Western principle or thought when you say play is unadulterated tomfoolery, if you know what I mean. It's but when I say play, in my mind, I'm thinking mindfulness. So to use a silly analogy, if I'm reading a book, for me that's a sense of play. I could argue now that when I do the garden, I used to hate gardening, but now when I do the gardening, I feel present, and I
yeah,
feel like it's a sense of mindfulness when I'm doing it,
yeah,
because there's nothing else I'm thinking about. I'm not doing the garden and thinking about my work the next week or what's going on the week before. I am 100% present on whatever I'm doing at that time. So
yeah.
would there be any logic in thinking that when you play, that you are giving your attention to that thing?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact,
Yes.
if you, yeah, if you bring your attention to anything, you really are. It'd be great if we have if we had these little portable
Mm.
brain scanners that you could actually just look on your watch,
Yeah, that'll be
on your
next.
Apple Watch, and
That'll
you
be
could,
next.
I watch this space. You
Yeah.
shine the brain scanner, and just a wee band that goes around your head, and what
Yeah.
you would actually see is alterations in the prefrontal cortex, even as you're playing the game, as you're learning to give every shot your full focus, like see the ball come and keep your eye on the racket, push it all, and rather than take your attention away to your next shot too quickly, keep your attention on it all the way. I sometimes watch, I got in my head, I saw this image of Novak Djokovic, and it was slowed down. I was watching it on tennis TV the other day there on Instagram, and it slowed it down, and you could see the ball coming, and you could see Djokovic, and he went like that. He was full, maximal attention was on that ball, and it was like total focus. Then he took the ball, and his focus was still watching it like that, and not once did his attention go, next shot, what do I do
Yeah.
next? It was, he followed it all the way through, and all you could see was this intense focus on exactly what was happening in that moment, and that builds the prefrontal cortex,
Yeah.
giving everything your full attention.
This is brilliant. We need to do more of these, I think,
Yeah,
because there's so much crossover between. For me, this builds the bridge between what a lot of psychologists say, but it's in a much more concrete way.
yeah,
I don't want to be critical of the sports psychologists that I've seen, but in my opinion, too often they focus on just the act without selling the why
yeah,
of it. And tennis players or competitive sports people are stubborn at the best of times,
yeah,
and never more so than when they're told what to do.
yeah,
But if you talk about that kind of what's that Harvard Business School equation for change of behavior, it's like the dissatisfaction plus vision plus first step has to be greater or equal to the cost of the change.
yeah,
So tennis players quite often, if they are of a certain level and they're successful, to sell them a change, they need dissatisfaction.
yeah,
So if you were able to use these kind of scientific methods and maybe what's the word, make them a bit more layman terms, but actually deliver them so they know what's going on, you would create dissatisfaction, because you could say, well, are you happy at
yeah,
the moment that this is what you're thinking, feeling, and behaving in?
yeah.
So it would be another tool that we could use to make it come to life.
Absolutely. This is why I love the kind of hard science. It's really why here's the why, but it's really why I talk about the science of things, because I find that if people understand why something is, they're far more likely to do it.
Yeah,
So
100%.
over the years, even writing my books and giving talks, I've just got into a habit, an ingrained habit of always backing everything up with science, because then people are more likely to do the sensible things if you understand why, what actually happened. Here's what actually happens. People are more likely to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I think people are
Definitely.
more likely to meditate, for example, if you understand that you literally are changing the physical structure of your brain. It's not just
Yeah.
something that feels nice. You're literally changing the physical structure of your brain, just like you would change the physical structure of your muscles. If you started to exercise that muscle, there's a physical change in the density and the size of the muscle. Exactly the same thing happens in the brain. It's
Yeah.
just called neuroplasticity and not muscle growth, but it's exactly the same idea, same concept. And so I find by understanding why something is, we're far more likely to do the things that are really useful for us.
Yeah, amazing. It's I do think there's opportunity for us to do more of this in the future if you're
Definitely,
up for it, or
this has been
maybe we did a presentation together in Dunblane.
so we did, yeah,
Was
the
it
tennis
last
court.
year? Was it last year?
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah. So there's definitely room. There's a space in tennis for this kind of work
Yeah, I
and
think,
maybe the two worlds can collide a little bit more. So
yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap between what we're talking about here. It's
hmm.
been a great conversation,
Yeah, it's
actually.
been good fun.
Unrehearsed, unscripted, just
I
it
know
felt
it's
like
just
a
a
nice
chat.
conversation, actually.
Yeah, it's just a chat. Well, we've always had good chats,
Yeah,
normally
yeah,
over red wine,
yeah,
but.
yeah. Normally over too much red wine.
So, well, thanks very much. That's a fantastic 34th entry into my tennis journal. And when this COVID fiasco is over, we will definitely have to get back to having more red wine and getting back on the tennis court, not in that
I
order.
I certainly look forward to that, and I'll try and win a point against you on the court.
Thanks very much, David.
Thanks, Chris.